Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Art of Procurement. So firstly, I just really wanted to give a big thank you for listening to the show today. It really is nothing without you, and I've truly been humbled by the support that I've received from the procurement community since I started the Art of Procurement, and also just fascinated by the global reach of the show. It really has been listened to on all continents and from countries ranging from Estonia to Madagascar, and of course UK, the US, and Australia. So a big thank you for listening to the show today. If it's the first time that you've listened, then welcome. To check out what you've missed, you can go to artofprocurement.com, or you can go to iTunes and search for Art of Procurement, and you can find all of our back episodes so far. You can download those and everything that we've published to date. So today I really have a special guest, and that's Andrew Karpie. So Andrew is really a leader in the field of workforce staffing models, and in particular, he focuses on the rise of the independent worker and the tools and technologies that are going to enable companies to take advantage of the growing freelancer economy. I've followed Andrew's work for really a long time, most recently with Spend Matters, and I was really delighted when he accepted my invitation to be on the show. In the Art of Procurement today, we're going to touch on a number of areas with Andrew. Here are just some examples. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is a work intermediation platform, how it's going to evolve, and really importantly, the transformation in both procurement and the services market that intermediation platforms may lead to. Secondly, we'll discuss freelancer management systems and how they can be used to manage independent talent pools for companies. And then we're going to talk about the trends that are really happening, and we're really at the start of this trend, that companies are consuming independent workers not on an FTE basis anymore, but on an activity or a task basis. And we'll consider what impact that might have on the procurement professional. Okay, so that's enough from me. Let's go straight into the show. Okay, and welcome to another episode of The Art of Procurement, and I'm really excited to welcome Andrew Karpie to the show today. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Well, I gave a brief introduction to our listeners in the pre-show before we hit the record button.
Okay.
But there's one comment that stood out to me as I was looking more into your background, and I just wanted to repeat that, and it's from when you joined Spend Matters. And this just gives listeners an insight into what I think that you do. And I reference this because I believe it to be true, to be honest. And the comment was that you're the most knowledgeable independent voice in the market when it comes to the future of the contingent workforce, including the rise of freelancers and independent contractors as a complement to traditional staffing models. And I think that gives a great kind of introduction to the work that you do with Spend Matters.
So that sounds fair enough.
Yes. Yeah. And so I bring that up because, obviously you didn't start by having such an in-depth understanding of the market in terms of the rise of freelancers and independent contractors. Could you give a quick overview of your background and how you came to focus on staffing industry?
Well, I am an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
I come to the staffing industry, the contingent workforce space as an outsider. However, an analyst who has been involved in service industries and technology and the intersection of them. And roughly 5 years ago, with an interest in various industries where intermediation occurs, I became drawn to workforce and the sector that intermediates work arrangements. And at that point, I became involved as a research analyst with an organization that probably plenty of people listening know, and that was Staffing Industry Analysts.
Yeah.
And there I became familiar and in depth with the staffing industry, particularly from the perspective of staffing suppliers. At the same time, my research pursuit in the area of technology and how it was affecting that industry led me to become very focused on the emergence of new forms of technology, what I would call work intermediation platforms. So technology beyond VMS that would support new types of work arrangements with freelancers and others. And really an emerging part of the contingent workforce space, as was suggested in that quote you read. Over time, I became very specialized in this area, and gradually my interest shifted from what specifically was going on to how enterprises were going to deal with this. And that led me to my current role as a research analyst with Spend Matters.
So I've been involved in contingent labor for probably 10 years or so as a hirer or overseeing the buying of MSPs or VMSs. And it seemed like the market just was pretty stagnant for a long time. And then all of a sudden, I'd say, I don't know, the last 4 or 5 years, there's just a myriad of options that seem to have appeared in how we can identify and engage contingent labor. So how has the labor market evolved, or how has the contingent labor market evolved over the past few years, and what are the triggers do you think that are driving that change?
Yeah, well, I think the evolution itself has been gradual, even over that period, incremental. But I think there are a lot of developments that are looming on the periphery that are now beginning to come into play. Of course, over the past 5 years, I think all of the focus has been on SOW or services. So, a new way of organizing contingent and consuming contingent work. But in the past 2 years or so, there has begun to be an awareness of these work intermediation platforms or technology-based ways of engaging workers, contingent workers, or organizing their work into a whole set of different forms that can be consumed by enterprises. And I have in mind their platform-based services such as crowdsourcing and others.
What are some of the examples of the intermediation platforms that you see? I think that people are familiar with the idea of an Uber or a Lyft or even a Fiverr or a Upwork, which was Elance and Odesk. Is that where it is, or are the other companies that are kind of taking that to the next level on an enterprise basis?
Yeah, well, I think the most well-known type of platform, online work intermediation platform, is what I would call an online freelancer marketplace. And certainly most of the transactions have been occurring there over the years, and most of the growth in that category. And these are companies like Upwork, freelancer.com, People Per Hour, etc., which allow freelancers, they may be virtual online freelancers, and they typically are, and businesses to find one another and enter into a complete work arrangement from beginning to end, the end being payment. Yeah, so that is really the largest category. There's a whole set of other categories that are probably less known, and all of these models are actually evolving, sometimes overlapping, and so it's a pretty complicated world out there that is developing.
Yeah, I feel it's really in the early stages of maturity, whether there'll be platforms that are ultimately be the one-stop shop, or whether it's going to be really niched down based on skill set or based on the type of person that you're hiring. An example is there's one out there for legal work. I think Rocket Lawyer, it may be called. Yep. Whether that's going to be whether it's going to go down that direction of you're going to have lots of niche firms, and then maybe they're bought up by somebody who then creates an enterprise level, or whether it's going to be an existing service provider who's a MSP or a VMS that takes that to the next level. I think that it's kind of still playing out, isn't it?
Most definitely, it is very unclear as to what is going to emerge. I mean, I have my own opinions based on the trends that I've seen, and I don't think we're going to see kind of monolithic players. People have speculated about whether, as perhaps in the case of Uber, where there is maybe a winner-take-all type of marketplace. I think we're going to see more of a diverse set of very digitized services and service providers that are going to link together and form ecosystems, or you can say supply chains, that will appear from the enterprise standpoint, kind of like suppliers. But it will really be a kind of supplier network. So that's my view of where things are headed.
Interesting. No, and so that's kind of where I think I see things going as well. I don't think there's going to be a winner takes all. I see that you need niche players to build, to really build, kind of have a brand around a specific area, but also so that it takes some of the risk away, that companies know that they're dealing with somebody who's an expert in what it is that they're buying, with the service that they're buying or the expertise that they're buying. But yeah, there's got to be ways of bringing that all together, because companies don't want to manage 20 different service providers. They want to look at it as if they're buying one, even though beneath the cover, it's a bunch of different companies that are all kind of tying up into under the same technology, maybe, that's allowing a company to manage it as one.
Right. But ultimately, there will have to be some types of solutions that will integrate and aggregate those supplier ecosystems. And we have been seeing developments over the past 2 years in that area. There is a type of solution that has been called freelancer management system. I'm not sure, Phil, if you're familiar with that.
I am, but yeah, if you could just give a brief overview, just in case any of the listeners aren't.
Sure. Well, and I've actually written about this, comparing freelance marketplaces, online freelance marketplaces, and freelance management systems. And freelance management systems are not marketplaces. They are solutions that individual enterprises use to basically organize and aggregate their own private, independent talent pool, independent worker talent pool, or talent pools, to have workers vetted, to have a way of buyers in the enterprise engaging specific workers, and ultimately to pay those workers, depending upon their classification. If they're W-2'd, they would be payrolled. If they're classified as ICs, they would be paid differently. But those are the basic functions of a freelancer management system.
Interesting. So kind of like a private MSP or VMS all rolled into one that focuses on talent that they've already pre-engaged or pre-vetted, that somebody in the organization can just go and kind of reach out to and use for one job. And there's no more in it than that, than just delivering them for a few hours or for a certain activity or a task. And then they go back into the pool to be used again when somebody else in the organization needs them.
That is correct. And, the concept entails a freelancer management system coexisting, integrating with VMS and MSPs.
So kind of the adoption of this, and which obviously relies on an increase in the number of independent workers or freelancers, for this to kind of self-sustain itself. I read a lot about the growth of the freelancer economy, And I know MBO Partners puts out a great report every year, I think it is, that looks at where the freelancer economy is going and what the trends are and what they see for the future. Where do you see the freelancer economy going? Is it maturing? Has it got a lot of growth in it? Or is it just, are we looking at the same people as we did before and just calling them something different?
Yeah, of course, the jury is still out on that. And, there are kind of multiple sets of statistics that suggest different sizes of the population and growth rates, et cetera. But it appears to be a growing population, and I think it's driven by a number of factors. At the root of it is, of course, enterprises looking to have non-fixed costs, variable, flexible labor forces. So that's certainly a big driver. At the same time, as we've been discussing, new technologies are arising that support those types of engagements. And then last but not least, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, workers are moving into that kind of independent workforce freelance model.
Yeah, I think a lot of time there's that they're seeking out the workers that have a lot of opportunities, rather than being in one job in one enterprise, can have the opportunity to really multiply the revenue opportunities by creating the same value for multiple different people. I think it's creating a really good opportunity for people to now and go and do that. And perhaps from my personal perspective, I know for me, the Affordable Care Act was a driver in thinking that, I can actually go and do something like that because I don't feel tied to an organization for healthcare. In the US specifically, I think that's a big driver.
Yes, and then you even have new private platform companies such as Stride Health, which provides its services to companies like Uber and Lyft, and recently partnered with Intuit Self-Employed. Stride Health is basically a platform that is directed at independent workers and freelancers to help them access healthcare, health insurance, and to help them manage their health insurance and healthcare over the course of a year to year.
Interesting. I need to check that out personally.
Yes. And so there are lots of new solution providers that are arising within this, what I'm calling the independent workforce solution space. Something that I was referring to before, that serve different functions, I think the emergence of these solution providers and their integration are going to be a factor in enabling independent freelance work and make that population grow.
So to take it to the next level then, and this was an article that you wrote that really caught my eye, and you talked about the concept of Joe as a service. The kind of headline of a person kind of splitting up a person into multiple different tasks that person does, and you can then take those tasks and have them performed by whoever is the best person wherever it is in the world, whoever has the most expertise, rather than one person doing everything. Right.
Yes.
I don't know if you probably do a much better job than I of explaining that, but that's a concept that I think really has a big potential to impact the way that we work, both as procurement professionals, but also in how we manage our service providers.
Sure, yes. And of course it was a kind of tongue-in-cheek
right.
Illustration, but intended to convey the basic concept, which is, I think it's conveying the shift from consuming contingent workers as individual contingent workers to consuming work in many different new forms as a service that will be dependent upon or be driven or made possible by accessing the labor services of workers across a whole different set of dimensions. And for example, their time availability, their location, whether they are online, offline, on site, and whether some of the work can be of different individuals can be pieced together into an entire solution or service, such as occurs with crowdsourcing, microtasking. Really, it's about the technology, and I think this is what is very important for procurement and the point that I was trying to make and kind of vividly make, which is the whole paradigm for procuring and consuming work is shifting to procuring and consuming work in a whole different set of contingent work in a whole different set of modes or forms, not just temporary workers, not just statement of work projects, and that is an opportunity and a challenge for finding ways how to manage that consumption, and also, as you kind of alluded to earlier, how to deal with supply sources of those labor services.
Yeah, it's interesting that this was, I guess, one of the value propositions that was originally sold by outsourcers, and when they were focused on labor arbitrage outsourcing was, you can send over, you can piece up a part of a job and send it off to a low-cost location and have somebody in the high-cost location focus on the more strategic work. But that required long-term consulting or long-term outsourcing engagements with a service provider to do that could cost millions and millions of dollars. What this is now giving people the opportunity to do is manage this on a piece-by-piece basis so that they can truly build a solution that fits exactly what they need at probably a much, much lower cost than if they had to outsource piecemeal, a whole process across the entire company. It's kind of taking it to the next step.
Right. And I think the implications of that are, as you've suggested, are flexibility, the ability to shape the workforce solution or what is actually being consumed to something, to a specific use case. And then finally, of course, the efficiency involved in terms of there being very little overhead, being able to squeeze out the overhead or fixed costs associated with, for example, an outsourcing relationship.
And do you think that this is just limited to what you may call non-core, like tactical transactional activities, or do you think everything's on the table where this can be applied to?
You mean in terms of
kind of the job
type of work?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I think everything is on the table. Maybe not completely everything, but yeah. I mean, there is all kinds of evidence of that. I think a good example is a platform. Maybe you've heard of it, called Topcoder,
no.
which is now part of another Aperio.
Okay.
But Topcoder is basically a platform that allows a company to put out a project into a crowd, a vetted crowd of developers, including designers, architects, and have those developers frequently team up or to have been teamed themselves to basically address this project. And sometimes multiple teams are competing to address that project. And so, basically you're not just having a software developer engaging one on a online freelance marketplace platform to do a specific task, but you're actually putting out what can be a fairly significant software development project. So I think that gives some indication.
Yeah, and so one of the risks that I see is, who manages the performance, who manages the output. Do you see that being, somebody within an organization that ultimately is responsible for pulling together all these pieces of people and putting it back together, and that's the program management skill set that's needed for this to be successful? Or do you see there being intermediaries, who will take all that behind the scenes and then package it up into what looks a lot more seamless, and then obviously take responsibility for the delivery?
Right. I mean, I think it's going to be more of the latter, where the intermediaries take more of the responsibility, like the outsourcers. I mean, certainly there's going to be a broad range, but certainly it's not going to eliminate the need for contingent workforce buyers, services buyers. It's just going to make their lives more interesting and challenging. But I do think that there will be a lot of outsourced, you could say, outsourcing of the or shifting of the responsibility for the outcome, just as is occurring in the SOW world today. And in the platform side, we're seeing a couple of examples of that happening already, where, for example, in microtasking activities such as provided by platforms like Mechanical Turk, and maybe that's not a good example, but companies like Crowdflower and others that basically contract with the business to provide certain outputs, and the platform provider is responsible for having their platform produce output that meets certain criteria.
Yeah, and they just change behind the scenes rather than having a huge delivery center somewhere, whether it be offshore or onshore. In delivering it, they now access this talent pool, and they become the experts in how you manage these people. But they were able to deliver it at a much lower cost, and I imagine a lot more flexible than you could do on a traditional outsourcing engagement for an SOW outsourcing.
Yeah. Yes, that's correct. And frequently, I mean, whereas traditional outsourcers would have done that using their own internal systems and so forth, these platforms really perhaps provide the major part or the major underlying set of components and processes for actually managing the distribution of work, how it comes together, etc.
How fast is change occurring? Is this something that's more at the visionary stage, or are companies actually making the move, not necessarily en masse, but certainly going beyond early adopter stage to integrate these kind of practices into their business?
Yeah, it kind of varies by area, by platform area. I mean, all of it certainly is at a very immature stage, and particularly for large enterprises. But I think that in terms of platforms like freelance management platforms, online freelance management platforms, enterprises and contingent workforce buyers are just now starting to. They've certainly been rapidly becoming more aware of them, and they are starting to engage with those types of platforms. But it's it's been reported it's a very small percentage, but the percentage is being shown to increase, to be increasing over time. So that is definitely taking place, but it's definitely at an early stage. Another type of model, crowdsourcing of innovation challenges, for example, is really thriving. It's not as large as the online freelancer segment, but over the past years, there have been many enterprise adopters, consumer product businesses, companies like Starbucks, a large number of major enterprises that are using these types of services. However, I think so far these types of projects have been direct engagements with marketing departments. Right. They don't consist of, they're not projects that are being done repetitively. They're occasional. So I think they're flying under the radar of the procurement groups at this stage.
So more. Let's rephrase that. So it's less about they have a specific business challenge or an issue with innovation and they want to crowdsource a solution to it that could be accretive to the business, and more about let's use this platform as a way of engaging with potential customers so they feel like they have a say in how we're running our business or how we're bringing new products to market.
Right. It can range from engaging with customers, engaging with the general crowd, but also sometimes engaging with expert crowds.
And so when we look and talk about the intermediation platforms as a whole, and the changes that are on the horizon, do you see that it's got the potential to be transformative, or is this always going to be a small part of the contingent workforce market?
Well, no, I mean, I think it is going to be transformative. And I think that, that goes along with how enterprises will transform. I guess the way I would describe that is becoming more networks of managing resources where the boundaries maybe are more fluid and less rigid. I think there's a general trend among enterprises toward once again a less fixed cost, more flexible workforce, and so I think technology, these types of technology, are going to become enablers for enterprises to become more efficient and have work performed in a range of different ways. And of course, that's going to be augmented. It's going to interact with other types of technology, such as artificial intelligence and robotics, etc. And so I think over the next 10 to 50 years, we're going to be seeing a very transformative set of developments.
And it feels like that's kind of been the desire of companies since the recession or the Great Recession, or however you want to term it. But since 07, 08, that's been the idea, is to build a lot more variable cost structure teams within enterprises, but they haven't necessarily had the technology to do it or the maturity to do it. And maybe the technology is finally catching up with that desire. So there's now something that companies can use to ultimately get what they want, which is as little fixed cost as possible.
Yeah, and I certainly globalization of the economy and kind of flattened world for engaging and consuming resources, I think goes along with that. Yep.
Sorry, Andrew, I was going to say that there was one thing that you mentioned just a little while ago about robotic process automation. That's something that also really fascinates me, and I wonder if RPA, is it something that is going to compete with the jobs as a service trend, or do you think that they'll both coexist and kind of between them have a double whammy impact on what the jobs of the future are going to look like?
Yeah, I think we're going to see both. I think some types of work are going to be eliminated by the automation. We're already seeing it in the legal field, for example, in terms of the discovery process. But at the same time, what we're seeing in the platform area is the use of analytics to support the types of changes in types and forms of work that can be delivered. So analytics are playing that role, and They're also beginning to play the role of complementing workers in terms of what they are able to do. And, this is maybe not a good example, but take telemedicine for one, and where technology is supporting the delivery of healthcare services remotely and so forth.
So looking at it from a procurement perspective, there's an opportunity where you can use, whether it be automation or whether it's analysts or offshore labor or whatever it is, to provide intelligence that can then be turned back into something that's actionable, that a strategic buyer or a professional back at base can use, and then it really multiplies their own performance. So it's not necessarily just trying to reduce the cost of delivering a particular service, whether that's procurement or whether it's anything else. It's actually providing the information, the data that a company doesn't have the ability to use their high cost resources to go and get to, which then ultimately increases the ROI of those people and makes them more effective in their job. So I think that it's an enabler. It shouldn't be looked just at a cost reduction.
Yes, definitely. And this may not be a great example, but consider driverless vehicles, for example, trucks that might carry cargo. And, in this case, of course, there is the elimination of the truck drivers, but there's a whole set of benefits beyond that cost savings of eliminating that job. Those come with a reorganization of the whole supply chain, overlay the Internet of Things on top of that, and you start to have a much more dynamic and efficient supply chain. So there is a whole set of opportunities, considerations that begin to come into play that are not simply cost reduction, and those will have to go into the calculations of procurement practitioners.
Yeah, and I see, so on a daily basis, it's interesting, you hear professional practitioners and services professionals say that this isn't going to happen to their company, that maybe their companies, the roles that they do is too valuable to be impacted by these trends. I think the reality is obviously very different. What kind of advice can you give to procurement practitioners, as an example, to really start to take advantage of these shifts?
Right. I mean, it sounds maybe very basic, but I tend to see that, and this is true of any specialization, but in the specialization of procurement, I think it's, once again, as any specialization tends to become siloed, very focused on kind of the current state of things, the current challenges. I think that's especially true at this point in the procurement area, whereas other disciplines, I'm thinking in science, engineering, they tend to be looking, those professionals tend to be looking ahead at what's changing and so forth. And as you said at the beginning of this conversation, there's been a long period of, I don't know if you would call it stagnation or stasis. Things have remained pretty much the same. Change has been very incremental. And it looks like we may be heading for some major discontinuity. So I think it's very important for professionals who, plan to be practicing over the next 10 or 15 years or even more, for younger folks, younger than myself, to start to look at what is happening and start to allocate time to that, not to be skeptical and closed-minded about it, but to adopt a real learning attitude, not just about acquiring better skills, but about what they're doing today, but really starting to look more strategically and at some of these changes that we've started discussing and considering the implications of them, because they are coming down the pipe.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that you mentioned was learning, and every single person that I've talked to on the show has highlighted the importance of learning and the importance of kind of keeping abreast of the changes that are happening in our industry, because there really is so much change that is coming down, and there's ways to take advantage of it, and there's ways obviously that will take advantage of you, and by knowing what those changes are going to look like, it really positions you from a career perspective to be on the end of using that to your advantage and kind of maximizing the benefit that these changes can bring, as opposed to being left almost head in the sand. This isn't going to impact me, and then 5 years down the road there's a big change that it's difficult to react to.
Yes, absolutely, I agree. And once again, I think there's a certain I don't want to say laxity, but a certain comfort with where things are at and where they've been, and I think there are going to be plenty of changes, and the learning process focus must shift more into what's coming, as opposed to getting better at what you're doing right now. You still need to do both, but the future component is certainly somewhat absent, and so there's a lot more learning that's coming. That's sure. Going to be a part of the procurement space.
So we've come to the end of the show today. I'm cognizant of the time, and Andrew, I'd just like to thank you for taking part in the discussion today. I think that it's a fascinating topic, and one that's really going to shape the way that we work, both as individuals within our procurement career, but also the way that we buy services, because obviously it's not just going to impact us, it's going to impact the way that the enterprise operates. If listeners would like to reach out, where can they best connect with you?
Yes, probably and I would welcome that, and probably the best way to reach me is through email, and that would be, maybe you're going to provide that information, but it would be Karpie@matters.com.
Okay, great. Yes, I will link up with your contact details, also any notes from the show, and we mentioned a few different publications and articles in the show, so I'm going to link to those as well in the show notes. So those are going to be available at artofprocurement.com/as-a-service. That's all one word, as a service. And those should be online right now as the interview is published. So, Andrew, thank you very much again for your time today, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
Phil, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be talking with you today.
Thanks.
Thank you.